Let's get to our first story here, and we want to talk more about central bank independence, which is big right now in the United States and technically around the world. Apparently, it's the most sacrosanct thing out there as it concerns the economy. And to help us sort through all of this, we are very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Michael Roberts, the socialist economist. He's author of many books. Also, by the way, writes a great blog, The Next Recession, that if you're not following it, I don't know what you're doing. Michael, thanks so much, as always, for being with us.
Well, thank you, everybody. I was really enjoying your conversation. So I suppose now we've got to talk about the dark side of things when it gets down to central banks. But it was really interesting what you were saying before.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Good to know we have at least one fan out there. And, I'll start. There's a lot to be said here. I mean, obviously the phrase central bank independence is being thrown around all over the place in the United States. But I want to start somewhere maybe even a little bit more fundamental about what a central bank even is, because I think a lot of this is people just hear it, they see it, and it takes on this kind of mystical sense. Like, what is this institution and what role is it playing in the economy?
Well, the central banks in various countries, they're two roles, really. First of all, they, in effect, control the money supply. So only the central bank can print dollars, produce dollars, and create dollars, put them into banks as deposits and reserves if they so wish. And also they provide, as it were, the lender of last resort. So if banks start to collapse, the central bank can step in and get these banks floating again by giving them the funds to survive. So it plays a role of maintaining the financial sector in the interest of the financial sector and maintaining sufficient currency for the economies to continue to transact all the deals and so on. And they can vary the amount of supply of money that goes into the economy or the cost of that money, namely the interest rate that they would charge if you borrow it or if you lend it.
Can you explain to us from your perspective what's going on right now with regard to Trump's attempted firing of central bank governor Lisa Cook, who also, according to the latest news, there has now been an investigation opened by the Justice Department or launched a criminal mortgage and fraud probe into Lisa Cook. So, it seems to be using the Justice Department in a politicized manner. But yeah, what's going on here? Because there's also this kind of antagonism that a segment of the right has against the Fed, like more the libertarian-minded types who, for a long time, as long as I can remember, they've always had this like very anti-Fed attitude. So how do you explain that sort of like segment of the right that hates the Fed? And then how does that play into what we're seeing right now with Donald Trump trying to firing the head of the Fed in the U.S.?
Well, Trump wants to get control of the Federal Reserve. He doesn't have control of the Federal Reserve. He's not able to get the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates or to change its monetary policy in any way. That's decided by a board of the Federal Reserve, regional Federal Reserve governors, plus other people who have been appointed by the president in the past. And they have long terms of office, up to 14 years. So they're sitting there and they make the decisions on interest rates that they're going to charge to banks if they want to borrow money and on how much money is being supplied into the economy. Trump wants to get control of that. He's concerned. He's worried about the economy. It's beginning to decline. He's worried that tariffs are going to cause it further problems in the economy. Although he's continuing with this policy, he wants to get control of the Federal Reserve. And the moment the Federal Reserve isn't prepared to go down the road of cutting interest rates really sharply, which is what he wants. So he's called the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jay Powell, a numbskull and an idiot for not doing what he wants. And because they've not done it up to now, he's looking for ways to get majority control for his MAGA supporters on the board. So if he can get rid of a couple of members of the board and replace them with his own appointments, that's it, the plan. That's what's behind this particular attack on Lisa Cook.
Well, and I'm glad you're raising this because so much of this in terms of how it's playing out, and of course the IMF I know has been making a big push this year about the importance of central bank independence. Everyone trying to come in because this is a big concern with Trump, even going back to his last campaign, is the idea that the Fed is like independent and fair, and that they're just whatever they do, they don't think about good things. They just think about what's best for the economy, and it's all level, even playing field, and that there's no influence. And I've always felt, and you have a great piece about this, about central bank independence on Next Recession blog, that it's not so much that the people care about the politicization of the Federal Reserve. They just care about the policies that are actually being put forward if you had more democratic control of some sense.
Absolutely. I mean, the Federal Reserve was originally set up in 1913, guys, and it was set up by all the banks who had gone through a series of crises. So they wanted a sort of coordinating body which would provide them with financial support if they got into difficulties again. It was set up to keep the finance sector going. It wasn't set up to make things better for the rest of the Americans with employment and growth and so on by moving the interest rates. That became the mantra later on by mainstream economics, which claims that the central bank can help the economy by getting employment up and keeping inflation down by the manipulation of interest rates. This is, in my view, pretty skeptical we have to be about that possibility. And it's not an independent central bank, really. It's independent of democratic control by government and by Congress and by the people in general, but it's completely dependent and works for the interests of the finance sector. It works for Wall Street, not Main Street, and that's its objective. The fact that Trump wants to take it over doesn't mean that he wants to introduce a democratic control of the central bank. He wants to use it for his own purposes and his own interests. And that's why we have this conflict. But the central bank is not an independent organization, and it's not an effective organization in solving the problems that people face, like the huge rising cost of living we've had over the last 2 or 3 years, not just in the US, but in all the countries. 25-30% rise in price levels in the last 3 years. And what has the central bank been able to do about that? Nothing really. It hasn't been able to stop that inflationary spiral. It claims that it's controlling inflation, but really inflation is falling simply for other reasons, because supply breakdowns in the world have improved, and also economies are slowing down. The US economy is slowing down. So therefore, the demand is beginning to slow, and that means why inflation has dropped a little bit. But actually, in the last few months, Rainer and Eugene, it's actually been rising. And so the Federal Reserve's in a difficult position. If it claims that it can control inflation by keeping interest rates up, then it's reluctant to cut them. So we now have this political battle between Trump wanting to control the Fed and the Fed trying to be so-called independent and decide what interest rates will be in the interest of what they think, mainly for the bond market. The bond market doesn't like high inflation. That's why the bond market's been diving recently. And so there's a reluctance on the part of the Fed to cut rates. So we're going to have a big political battle here over the next few months.
Yeah, it really seems like a fight between different segments of the ruling class. But, on that note, I do want to ask, what would a democratically controlled central bank look like under a socialist or worker-oriented government?
Well, it would seem to me that what is the purpose of the central bank? We would want to maintain a stable situation for the currency as best as possible. We want to be able to keep the cost of borrowing, particularly for households or mortgages and so on, as low as we can in order to people be able to afford housing to some extent. Although obviously it's almost impossible for many people, Americans now, and in Brits too, to get affordable housing. And we would want a central bank that's going to play a role in stabilizing the currency. And that's perfectly possible for democratic control of a central bank. We would elect officials to that body, just as we elect them in other bodies and agencies in the States and elsewhere. And that body would operate and be accountable to the institutions of a workers' government, whether it's Congress or whether it's other organizations that have been set up by a workers' government. And say it would play that role. But at the moment, it doesn't play that role. It's not have that structure. Its structure is basically designed to support and finance banks, particularly when they get into trouble. We just saw a couple of years ago when a number of regional banks went down very quickly in the Silicon Valley area, and the Federal Reserve's attitude was to pile money in not let these banks go down or take them over. That wasn't the policy. The policy was to give them as much money as they needed in order to survive. That's their real operation. And it will be the opposite of the case with the workers' government central bank. It will operate in the interest of what working people need, not what the finance sector needs.
Well, I'm glad you make that point, and I want to ask you this before we let you go, because I think it's important because you write for the general public on these economic ideas, and I think this is economic concepts. I think this is another factor of these conversations that seems, important to me, is the idea that sort of average everyday people can't even understand all of this, and I think that's it's actually a point Bill Greider makes very well in his book, How the Federal Reserve Runs the United States, about how absurd this is. But I feel like so much is like you need it to be independent. You need these other people because there's no way you can actually understand that. And I think it's important to note that, part of a real sort of workers' economy is the idea that, like, yes, people can master how the economy runs, even if you don't necessarily have a PhD, from MIT.
Absolutely, Eugene. We're told, particularly by big banking agencies like the IMF and so on, we need the expertise of these people, these great economists and experts who sit on the boards, sit on the IMF, sit on the World Bank, because we don't know anything about it. They know best how to handle money. Well, they did a great job of avoiding the global financial crash in 2008, which they never saw coming, and they didn't know why it happened. They didn't know afterwards. They did a great job in avoiding the huge Great Recession we had 2008-9, and they did a great job during the period of the 2010s when inflation dropped really low, and they kept trying to raise inflation by cutting interest rates, and it made no difference. The expertise that these great economists go, and I'm one of them, not great one, that shows that we don't need that sort of expertise. What we need is democratic accountability of these organizations, so that insofar as people have got skills, they're accountable to the public, not accountable to the banking and financial system.
Well, as always, Michael, we really appreciate you joining us and helping us sort through it all. Everyone definitely has to be checking out Next Recession. We were talking before about the great artwork behind you, and Friedrich Engels, one of the people behind you there. You wrote a great book, Engels 200, that I hope people also check out. But as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me, Bronnie, and thanks for Eugene.